Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder on update 1.77 looking at another new aircraft. This is the Spitfire Mark 5B. It sits at rank 3, battle rating 3.7, and if my thing will stop bugging out, I'll show you where it is. So, it's right here on the tech tree just after the Mark 5B drop in this list of Spitfires. So, technically, if you don't want to get this aircraft, what you can do is just get the Spitfire Mark 5B drop and then move on to the F Mark 9. So this video is basically going to be, is it worth researching this, or is it worth just moving on to the F Mark 9? What you have at your disposal is two 20mm Hispano Mark 2s, which are sat in the wings here, and then you also have four 7.7mm Brownings on the outer wings, making convergence incredibly important in your fights. The max speed of 589 km an hour is quite nice, and of course, because it's a Merlin Spitfire with its Rolls-Royce Merlin 45, it has insane climb rate because it's light as hell, and also a good turn time. Modifications wise, what we see is a bunch of upgrades to the Mark II, which make it a hell of a lot better than what it starts with. It starts with very much in a shotgun-esque fashion, which can overheat incredibly quickly. And luckily, with the 1943 ones added, you get plus 300% to mean time between failures. The other one you get plus 120%. And then plus 40%. So you can see that getting these upgrades will help you a lot with your 20s on overheating. If you are more controlled with your bursts, then it is much better to get the flight performance upgrades to make sure that you have that rate of climb to get up to some of the enemy stuff. Now, over the years, the 20mm Hispanos used to be feared. Nowadays, they are not so feared because they seem to not do a lot of damage, and the main reason for this seems to be the HEF rounds just not being able to pen anything and not being able to set stuff on fire. What I would have recommended a year ago was to take the air target belts with the Hef-Y, Hef-Sappy, Hef-Sappy, but nowadays I stick to stealth, which, even though it's not that much better than the air targets, it does have that AP shell, and on top of it, at least the enemy can't see when I'm shooting. If I look at any of the other belts, the only one that I may be able to recommend is the Universal. But the issue with that is every clip, or every 4 rounds, you have a useless round in it, so stealth seems to be the way to go. The 7.7mm, it's kind of an interesting one. The tracer belt has actually been changed. They used to be just IT ages ago. Nowadays, it's IT API. And I think if you are going to run like air targets, if you're part of the old crew or Universal, I think tracers could work on the offensive 7.7mm. But because I'm sticking with stealth on the offensive 20s, I stick with stealth on this, which is API. So once again, not a lot of penetration, but at least if we cause a fire, it should cause a lot of damage. Every round is good here, apart from the defaults, so getting these as maybe secondary upgrades to fuselage and radiator isn't a terrible shout, especially the 20mm. You get 120 ammo for the 20s, so you have to use them sparingly, but the 7.7's 1400 rounds of ammunition is quite a lot of them. It also has a not self-sealing fuel tank at the top, and a self-sealing one at the bottom. The armor model has been updated for the Spitfire, at least the early Spitfires, in update 1.77, and since then I haven't had any hits to the fuel really. I've only had hits from AA, which have hit stuff like this, the oil cooling system, and the liquid cooling system, but not the fuel itself, which is kind of nice. We also have liquid cooling systems in the wings. So yeah, with this extra armor, it has made this thing much more survivable, and also that is pretty much your main aspect of it, but we'll get into that in the in the gameplay portion. This thing doesn't get any camouflages, it is how it is, and that's pretty much it. So let's get into the history section. The submarine Spitfire Mark V was seen as a stopgap fighter. It was pretty much the stopgap between the Mark II and the Mark IX, which was going to be one of the best Spitfires ever made at the time. But what is kind of interesting about the history of World War II when it comes to the Spitfires and also other British aircraft is the stopgap ones are normally the ones which are the most successful, which is just one of those weird coincidences. So during World War II, it wasn't possible to allow a lot of time for development and production of the best aircraft, especially under the conditions of 1940 to 1942 in Britain. So shortcuts were put into place, and because of all the pressure of everything going on, the Spitfire Mark V came about. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Spitfire Mark I had pretty much just kept its superiority over the ME-109E or the BF-109E that we have in game, and the few Spitfire Mark IIs that took part in the Battle of Britain were a small increase in performance over the Mark I, not seen as a massive increase, but slightly better, meaning that they could outdo their German opponents still. So, even with this being the case, they decided to move on with more technology. In October of 1940, the air staff of the Royal Air Force turned to the question of a replacement aircraft for the Mark I and also the Mark II. Their successor to the earlier Marks was the Mark III. This had been under development since 1939 and had already flown. This aircraft had a number of significant features, including a new wing design, a retractable tail wheel, and a Rolls-Royce Merlin XX engine, which is a 20 engine. As a first step, the 1,120 Mark IIIs were ordered in October. So even though this was the case, it was realized that it would take some time to tool up production for the new aircraft, and thus, as an interim measure, Rolls-Royce were asked to install the new Merlin 45 engines into the basic Mark I airframe to produce the Spitfire Mark V. The Mark IV designation already having been allocated to the Griffon engine version of the Mark III. So the first 5 to enter service was delivered to a number 92 squadron in 1940 in the month of December. So as you can see, the Spitfire Mark V is very much an upgraded Mark I version, basically just installing a better engine in it, which is why in game it is very similar characteristically to it, just with a bit more power. Only 94 of the Mark V-A variants with 8 7.7 Browning machine guns were produced. All others were the 5B, armed with 2 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns, and in the course of events the 3 was to actually be cancelled, and some of the special features of that version were incorporated into the Mark V, and there was a total of 6,464 fighters built, or the versions of the Mark V built between 1941 and 43. The aircraft saw service with more than 140 squadrons of the RAF and was supplied to 9 foreign countries, including the United States. It was employed on all battlefronts during the war, and in many cases was instrumental in turning the tide of the war in favour of the Allied forces. In the first few months of 1941, the Spitfire V went into service with the 41st, 54th, 64th and 91st Squadrons, and then during May, the first Messerschmitt Bf-109F was encountered in combat, and the Mark V was publicly announced. By this time, production was underway of the aircraft, and the aircrafts were rapidly introduced into the squadrons, and by the summer, the RAF was on the offensive over the Low Countries in Europe. The offensive took the form of fighter sweeps and daylight bombings by Blenheims and Stirlings, and the Spitfire Vs provided escort cover for the bombers. And then by September, 27 squadrons were equipped with the Mark V-B. To use the Spitfire as a fighter bomber or with extra fuel tanks to escort the bombers, the 5C came off the production line later in the year, but we'll get into that aircraft another day. So by the start of 1942, there had been over 1,700 Mark Vs built. In January, Westland Aircraft built their first Mark V-B, the AR-318, and shortly afterwards, the submarine phased out the 5B in favour of the 5C. Castle Bromwich followed suit in the autumn when they were producing 8 to 10 aircraft per day. Just think about how insane that is. And then by the time of 1942, 3,300 Mark Vs had been built. The early months of this year were marked by a series of disasters suffered by the British forces in the Pacific, the North African desert, and of course the English Channel, all these events having an effect on the development and use of the Spitfire. Before September 1941, the aircraft's main opponent was of course the Bf-109F, but although this aircraft had slightly superior fighting qualities above 20,000 feet, its armament was light, and generally the Spitfire 5 was the better of the two aircraft. Then, as many of you may know, in September, the first of a certain aircraft started coming about. This was the Focke-Wulf 190, and they were met in combat over France, and with the exception of the smaller turning radius of the aircraft, the 190 was superior in all other aspects to the Mark V. In February 1942, the Germans sailed their three capital ships, the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen, through the Channel to return to Germany. During the resulting air battles, the Spitfires tangled with large numbers of 190s, and from then on, there was absolutely no doubt that the aircraft was outclassed by the Luftwaffe's new aircraft. The answer was the Spitfire Mark IX, developed as another stopgap using the Mark V-C airframe with the more powerful Merlin 61 engine. However, the Mark IX took time to bring into service in large numbers, just like the Mark V, and by June, or the Mark III I should say, and by June there were more squadrons of Mark Vs in service than at any other period of the war, 59 in the UK and 7 in the Mediterranean Sea. In August 1942, the first Mark Vs were used in North Africa. The aircraft found themselves opposed to the Bf-109F, and then the G model later on, and also the C-202 Folgore. Since most combat was done at low altitudes there, the aircraft had little trouble with the Bf-109F, although the Bf-109G was somewhat faster than it. Against the Italian 202, it seemed that the two aircraft were fairly evenly matched. The Italian, while superior in climb at low altitudes, was seriously undergunned. In the Far East, against the Zero, the aircraft was the first time outmaneuvered by an opponent, although it had superior levels of diving speeds. The last Spitfire Mark V from submarine was built in July 1942, at other factories built until 1943, and in September 1944 there were none anymore in operational units, to be basically replaced by Griffins and also the Mark IX. So that is the short history of the Mark V. An unlikely hero of the World War II for the British, something that you will see actually quite a lot through the World War's history, where basically you would have something which was like, well, we need to coddle something together to get us through this, and hopefully it's good, and then bang, a spark comes and you realize what you've made is great. But anyway, let's get into the gameplay. When I was playing the Spitfire Mark V-B, the one question that I had in my mind at all times is this a slightly better Mark II-B, or is this a slightly worse Mark IX? And by the end of playing it for quite a long time, I feel like it is definitely a slightly better Mark II-B. The Mark IX, one of the great things about it, it has really high dive speed on it, meaning that you can actually catch people in a dive that you need to. The Mark II-B does not have this, and the Mark V-B doesn't have this, not because that it doesn't have a good dive speed, because it can actually go over 700 kilometers an hour. The issue is that its engine knocks itself out when it tries to dive, which is a bit of an issue if you do it at a steep angle. At the same time, you don't have the guns to back it up. The Hispano Mark IIs do not do well at range, meaning that your convergence should be set around maybe 400 to be able to hit stuff, and also because you have the wing-mounted 7.7s, it's not as if you can just annihilate a target really quickly anymore. It is very sad to see the 20mm of the British, or at least the Hispanos, in the form of the Mark Is and the Mark IIs. Since I played the Whirlwind last patch, and now I've played the Mark V-B this patch, the Hispanos have really taken a hit to the power that they have, and I have really no idea why. A lot of the times, well, sometimes, it feels like you can annihilate planes very quickly. Other times, it takes you 120 rounds to do absolutely nothing. And to me, it seems to be how much armor is on the enemy aircraft. And there's not a lot I can do about that. Do I just not go after the stuff which is armored? And at the same time, this BR that you sit at in the Spitfire Mark V-B pretty much means you get set up against German teams every time. So instead of going through all of the matchups, I think it is worth just focusing on this one particular matchup because it's all I've seen over the last few days. The only other match I've seen is one map on Hokkaido where we annihilated the American team. So, let's talk about Germany. What does Germany have at this BR? Well, it has a bunch of BF-109s, which the Mark V matches up well against. The 109s definitely have the slightly higher altitude advantage, but the Mark V-B has the survivability to be able to drag the BF-109 down if it needs to. You can actually fight a BF-109 up. You just have to wait until it overshoots and then hit it, and then leave it alone, wait until it overshoots and hit it, and keep doing this, and it will work really well for you. It will work really, really well. The Focke-Wulfs is basically the same thing. Yes, you do have to wait for a mistake with the Focke-Wulfs or with the BF-109s, but you can force it with the way that you can defensively fly in this thing, because you still have maneuverability even at high altitudes. It matters much more about speed in this thing. If you can keep it over 300, you can turn like a god. So you've just got to make sure that you keep it over that 300 mark, which at higher altitudes can be hard to do, but you've just got to do it. Just make sure that you're watching that indicator. At the same time, just as a little side note while I go through this, the engine overheats incredibly quickly, so you're going to have to understand energy management, heat management incredibly well with this engine. One of the biggest issues with it is, especially on maps like Malta, it will overheat incredibly quickly. You'll have to knock it back to 90, sometimes 80 to cool it down. And I'm sure this is why this is the difference they made with this thing and the Trop version to make the Trop version actually usable. But if this was the state of the Spitfire, there is no way it would have been allowed in service, because it would just overheat so quickly you would not even be able to be combat effective in it. But anyway, back to the matchups. So against the Focke-Wulf and the BF-109, it's really fun. They're really fun matchups. Against the bombers, so the Do 217s and the BVs. The BVs can be a hassle, but the 20s will put holes in the wings. The DOs are the same way. It may take you 120 rounds of 20mm, but you'll do a lot of damage to them and to generally take them out. It's quite easy to trade 1-for-1 in these machines against German aircraft. Where the issue comes in, as it is with a lot of aircraft at this BR, is the P-47. The captured German P-47 right now is in high demand, and the reason for this is because, well, the HE-177 came out. I'm sure this may not be the case in a few weeks or so, once everyone has got the HE-177 or grinded the lines that they need for other aircraft, but right now you see a lot of very high-level players playing the P-47 captured, either whether it be Russian or whether it be German. And what is happening is they are annihilating teams as they go. 3 kills each in squads of 3 or 4, and they're just dicking on whole enemy teams. So the good thing about the Spitfire Mark V-B is it has great survivability. against all of these aircraft. But when you are left by yourself and there are 5 enemies around you because 3 or 4 P-47s have annihilated the rest of your team, it doesn't really matter how much survivability you have. It really doesn't at all. It just basically means that you're going to be left in the dust to be either killed by the P-47 coming in, the BF-109 coming in, or maybe the casual ME-410 who's decided to come to the party. So if we disregard the P-47, it's a really fun matchup. But at this moment in time, with the P-47 being how it is, and the top tier players exploiting it, then there's not really a lot you can do in this thing. Even though my KD in this is around about 2 to 1, so I'm getting 2 kills per 1 death. My win rate is 15%, because of all of these P-47s just annihilating everything. And it's very sad to see. And as I said, hopefully in a week or 2 this won't be the case and the Mark 5B will actually be usable. Because it is the best thing at 3.7 to take against these. There is no way I take a Typhoon against a P-47. It is just a better version of me. The Focke-Wulf 190, I don't take a Typhoon either. I would take the 190 every time. And the BF-109, it's negligible. But I would still take it over the Typhoon. I would not take any of those other aircraft over the Spitfire. Mainly because of my experience in it, and mainly because I know exactly the limits of the enemy aircraft and mine. The Spitfire Mark IIB was one of the first aircraft I ever flew in realistic, and I flew it a hell of a lot. I understand how these Spitfires work, I understand their limits, and I understand how they are. So to get another Spitfire, which is pretty much exactly the same as the Mark II, but with a bit more speed, it's great. It's really, really fun to use, and it takes me back to a time which was a lot simpler in War Thunder, and a lot more... you know, there was a lot less to worry about, especially when it came to the game itself. But nowadays, the Mark V is still a good aircraft. It is good if you're experienced with Spitfires, if you understand the survivability, if you know how to defensively fly, and maybe you are okay with... Like, some aircraft are not very forgiving, but the Spitfires are incredibly forgiving. If you cock up, you have armor behind you now with the new realistic, well, with the new flight and damage models that they have. You have a little bit more energy to deal with. If you have a good crew, you can turn all day long. The only issue you're going to run into is your team just falling apart around you, which can happen, and there's not a lot you can do about that. And getting back to base after your team has been annihilated, well, that's kind of hard to do too, because a lot of them don't let you. So yeah, right now, it may be really frustrating to fly this aircraft, but give it a few weeks, or give it a month, and it will be fun to fly. That's the way I see it, because right now, I know it's frustrating. But in a little bit, when the higher players move on to their jets or to their ground forces again, you'll be left with the average player at rank 2, rank 3. And then you will have a hell of a lot more fun. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.